This morning I want to talk to you about the covenants in the Bible. But I want to teach you about what a covenant is. It's a solemn binding agreement between two parties with obligations on both sides. But that's a very different thing from a contract. And the first lesson I want to teach you this morning is the difference between a contract and a covenant. We're very used to contracts because most of the business world is based on contracts. Most of our lives are based on contracts. And they're solemn agreements between two parties with obligations to both. So what's the difference? Well, let's deal with a contract first. Let's suppose that you want a builder to build a house for you, or the church wants a contractor to build a new church building. So what is a contract? It's the agreement because each party needs something that the other has. The builder has skill, labor, and materials, and the other party has money. And so they want to have a contract between them to put up the building. And the contract is negotiated between two parties, two equal parties, because they each have something the other needs. And therefore they can bargain with each other. And a building contract usually debates how much for the building, how long it will take, and a lot of other features. And then when both parties are agreed on the price and the time it's going to take and the rest of it, then a solemn contract is signed, sometimes sealed as well, but always signed. And once you sign that contract, it's binding. Unless either party fails to keep their side of the contract. And if either the builder doesn't build it on time or for the right price, or the customer doesn't pay up each month what the builder needs, then the contract falls through. One party can break it, and then the other party is free from the contract. Do you follow me? And life is full of contracts, hire purchase contracts, mortgages. These are all contracts that we've agreed by negotiation because we each have something the other needs. You can never have a contract with God. And I'll say more about that later. You can only have a covenant with God. The Bible doesn't talk about contracts. It talks about covenants. What's the difference? Well, a covenant is not negotiated because a covenant is between two unequal parties, one of whom is not in a position to negotiate or bargain. It is therefore a binding agreement between a strong person and a weaker person. And the weaker person can't grumble or complain about the terms of the covenant. They can only say yes or no. And when we come into a relationship with God, you can't bargain with God. You can't say, if I do this, will you do that? You can't negotiate it. You can say no, or you can say yes, and that's all you can do. It's a covenant between a strong God and weaker people. The simple reason for that is that we have nothing that God needs, nothing that he wants. And therefore we can't negotiate with God. One of the texts that I love to speak about is in Psalm 50, where it says this: God says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. That's a favorite text of mine. If God was hungry, he wouldn't come begging to you. And the next verse tells you why. It says, because the cattle on 1,000 hills are his already, and all the silver and the gold in the world is his already. So you can't bargain with someone who's got everything, can you? Because there's nothing that you have that you can bargain with. And therefore, people are very silly to try and bargain with God. Jacob did. Jacob, when he was running away from his father and his brother, he had a dream, Jacob's ladder. And when he woke up, he said, God, if you will bring me back to my father's house in peace, I'll give you 1/10 of all that I possess. 1/10 is a tithe. Now, he was trying to bargain with God, and you can't do that because all the money in the world belongs to God already, so you can't offer God's money because it's his already. You can give it back to him, but you can't bargain with him. And Jacob tried. Years later, Jacob had to find out the hard way that you can't bargain with God. And one night, God wrestled with him, and God won the battle and pulled his leg out of joint. And for the rest of his life, Jacob limped, couldn't walk straight because he had a bad hip. He'd been fighting with God and thought he could win a battle, but he couldn't. And Jacob became Israel. God changed his name, and he became the father of the nation of Israel to this day. And yet he limped for the rest of his life. God broke that man. He was saying, Jacob, you don't bargain with me. I'm the stronger one. I set the terms. So a covenant is very much a one-way binding agreement, whereas a contract is a two-way. And both parties negotiate and bargain with each other until they're agreed about the terms, and then they sign the contract. With a covenant, the stronger person offers the covenant, and you either sign it or you don't. You have no choice about the terms of the covenant. Now, I wonder if you've really understood what I've just said. A covenant is a one-way binding agreement in which one party decides all the terms of the covenant and the other party either accepts or rejects it, but that's the only choice they have. Now, let me ask you a question to see if you've understood what I've just said. Is marriage a contract or a covenant? Now think about that for a moment before you answer, and then I'm going to take a vote on it. Those who believe that marriage is a covenant, raise your hands. And those who believe marriage is a contract, raise your hands. 2. Well done, 2, for having the courage of your convictions. And how many don't like raising their hands in a meeting? All right, we'll leave that. The answer is that marriage used to be a covenant, but it is rapidly becoming a contract. And more, marriage is simply a contract, a negotiated contract between two equal parties. And there are even what are called prenuptial contracts, in which they agree who gets the money or the property if they have a divorce later. What an extraordinary development, but it's quite common now, because they're regarding marriage as a contract between two equals. And because nowadays feminism and indeed society generally regards men and women as equal, marriage is becoming a contract. And therefore, if one breaks the contract, the other is free to go and marry someone else. And that's why we're having an extraordinary increase in divorce and remarriage. I've just written a book about that. You'll find it on the bookstall at the back. But marriage used to be a covenant because it used to be believed that men were the stronger party and women were the weaker sex. And therefore, it was the man who proposed and the woman who accepted or rejected, but that's the only choice they had. And there was no negotiation. And that's why the woman took the man's name. And my wife is now Mrs. Pawson. She wasn't born that, but because I was regarded in a covenant as the stronger party, then she took my name. And that's why her father gave her away at the wedding and passed the authority over her to me. And there was nobody gave me to my wife, but her father gave her to me. It was an unequal covenant. It wasn't a contract. But all that's going. And in fact, an increasing number of brides are keeping their own name and becoming the boss in the house as well. So that the whole idea of a covenant is going. And therefore, marriage is regarded as something you can go into and something you can get out of. Just needs one of the parties to break the contract and stop loving, and the other is free to go away and find someone else. That's a contract view of marriage, and it's now the general view of marriage in our country outside the church. In the church, most people still see marriage as a covenant, and therefore many Christians don't see divorce and remarriage as an option. And when you study what Jesus said about divorce and remarriage, he didn't make it an option either. Marriage is for life. Till death us do part. That's a covenant. There was a man in the north of England not long ago whose wife, shortly after their marriage, got into bad ways. She started going out with other men. Then she left home and finished up back on the streets and made her life a mess. Now, the husband was a Christian, and his Christian friends said, "You should get a divorce. She doesn't care that much for you. She doesn't love you. You should get a good Christian wife. Get a divorce and find a good wife." And he said to them, "Never speak to me like that about my wife. She's my wife, and I shall love her as long as there's breath in her body." And she died a few years later as the result of the way she was living. And as she died, he was there, praying for her, loving her, even though she'd broken the contract again and again. But for him, marriage was a covenant, not a contract. And even though she'd broken her side, that didn't set him free, and he knew it. And his covenant love went on. Now, thank God he doesn't make contracts with us, because we're so weak and silly that we'd break it in no time. But throughout the Bible, God says, when I make a covenant, you may break it, but I never will. And that's where our security lies. A God who has a special kind of love, we call it a covenant love. And it's a covenant love because it's made based on promises which he will never break and which he will keep. Because he's a covenant-making God and he's a covenant-keeping God. Thank God he is. And we can rejoice in that and feel secure, because we know ourselves too well. And we know that our love can fail, our love for him. But his love is not going to fail, because it's based on a solemn promise, a solemn covenant. Now, in the Bible, covenants were often sealed with blood. Not just sealed with a seal like a contract can be, but sealed in blood. Can we find an equivalent to a covenant in our daily life? We know what contracts are because we're always into them. can we find a covenant in daily life? Yes, we can. Have you made a last will? You know what I mean? Even if you've only got a little money or a little property, you should make a will, or you're going to cause a lot of trouble to those who survive you. And who knows if they'll die young or old? None of us know. So we should make a will. And it's called a last will and testament. Have you heard that phrase? Well, now, testament is the same as the word covenant. Same word. That's why your Bible is divided into two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament, meaning the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And so I've made my last will and testament, and so people will know exactly what will happen when I go. And I'm much nearer that than many of you are, statistically. At 82, I'm already counting my days with wisdom. And so I've made a will, and people will know exactly what little money I leave behind goes, and what happens if my house is sold and goes, and what happens if my car goes. They know where it'll go. It's a covenant. It's not a contract. And whoever receives what I leave behind receives it because I made a testament, a covenant. Now, a covenant can be conditional or unconditional. My last will and covenant is unconditional. I haven't made any conditions. I could have done. I could have said, you won't receive this till you're 21. That's a condition. Or I could have said, as some people do, you'll have to change your name to mine to preserve the family name, and then you can inherit my money. That's a conditional covenant. So there can be conditions, or there can be an unconditional covenant in which you promise things to people and make no conditions at all. They'll receive them anyway. Some of God's covenants are conditional, and some are unconditional. And it's important that we know which. I'm going to take you through the covenants of the Bible. There are 5 of them. And they're all based on promises of God, that he voluntarily made a covenant with people, putting himself under obligation to those people. That's an amazing thing, that God, who made the whole universe, makes promises to people, some of them conditional, some of them unconditional, but on the basis of those promises, he is now in a covenant relationship with them, which they may break, but he never will, because they're not contracts. God never said, if you do this, I'll do that. I've heard Christians try and make contracts with God. God, if you'll cure my cancer, I'll go to church every Sunday for the rest of my life. Have you come across contracts like that? And the modern form I've heard in many churches is, you give 1/10 of your income to God and he will make you prosperous. Have you heard that one? There are preachers all over the world saying that, and it's encouraging people to have a contract with God. I'll pay 10% of my income to you and you make me prosperous. God has never made that kind of promise to people. He makes covenant promises, but that would be a contract promise. And we must have nothing to do with contracts. Well, let's start by looking at the covenant with Noah. It was after God destroyed the world with water. You know the story of Noah's flood. And after that terrible flood, when the population died and only 8 people survived, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and his 3 daughters-in-law, just 8 of them in the ark, and they survived. And as soon as they got out of the ark and the earth was dry again, God said, now, Noah, I'm going to make a covenant with you, and I promise never to do that again while the earth remains. And God has kept that promise. Here we are this morning. We could have been drowned in a flood. The whole population could be destroyed by God in a moment. But he promised not to do it again. And he hasn't. Thank God for that, or I wouldn't be here to preach to you. So that was his promise. And it was a promise of survival. I've underlined the word survival. He promised that the human race would survive and that he would keep them alive. And by doing that to the seasons, by seed time and harvest, summer and winter, every year God promised there would be the seasons. And it's from those seasons that we get our food. If there weren't seasons for sowing and reaping, if summer and winter didn't come, it would be very difficult for us to survive. Impossible, actually. Because there are two things that we need to survive. One is light, sunlight, and the other is water. And without light and water, none of us could live. They're the source of all our food, the rain and the sun. And God said, I'm going to wear a ring to remind me of my promise. That's why I wear this wedding ring, to remind me of the promise I made to my wife. And God says, my ring will appear in the sky as a rainbow. And whenever the sun and the rain come together, you'll see my ring in the sky. And every time you see a rainbow, you should thank God for his covenant with Noah. And interestingly enough, he said, that rainbow is not to remind you of my covenant with Noah, but to remind me of the promises I made to him. So when you see a rainbow, just say to yourself, God, are you looking? That'll remind you. Keep your promise and keep the world going. Do you know that there is enough food in the world for everybody to be fed? And there always has been, every year. And I have the United Nations Food Authority to confirm me in that. Nobody need go to bed hungry. Nobody need to starve, just nobody. The trouble is that the food that God has provided is kept in some countries and kept from others. It's a tragedy that some parts of the world have problems with overweight, while there are millions of people going to bed hungry. It need not be. God has kept his promise. He's told us to share the food with each other, and every year, according to the international figures, there is enough food in the world to feed everybody in it, even though the population's growing. Starvation is man-made, not God-made, and we must never blame God for it. He's kept his promise, and we should be able to feed everybody. It's our selfishness that prevents that. Shame on us. And so God has made this promise. It is an international promise to the whole world, and everybody benefits from it. In fact, Jesus in the New Testament said God sends his rain and his sun, whether people are good or bad. He sends them both, on the good and the evil. God keeps everybody alive. He's promised to do so. So that's the promise, I will. Except this time it was an I will not. I will not destroy the population of the world again. And he never has. The next thing is, were there any provisos, any provisions, any conditions to this covenant? And the answer is yes, there were. God did expect us, since he was preserving life, to respect life. And therefore, in two ways, he said, respect human life. And the way he told us to respect human life was to take the life away from murderers, what we call capital punishment. That is God's will for the human race, that murderers die. Unfortunately, the world is now ignoring that expectation of God on a wholesale scale. Britain no longer hangs murderers. One country after another has stopped hanging or executing in other ways with electric chairs or beheading or whatever, or injection. But many, many parts of the world now no longer do this. And when in the 1960s, the British government abolished capital punishment and said we will no longer take the lives of murderers, I made a prediction. I said this shows a loss of respect for human life. And therefore I said the next thing on the government's agenda will be abortion. And after that will come euthanasia, where you put granny down like an old dog. And that's just about here now. And all of it is a loss of respect for the sanctity of life. Do you understand what I'm saying? Read up Genesis chapter 9. You'll find there the covenant that God made was, I'll preserve life by keeping the seasons going, but you must respect life. And if anyone takes life, then that life must be taken from them, because that keeps respect for life. And since Britain abolished execution of murderers, respect for life has gone down, bound to go down, because capital punishment shows you respect for the life of the victim. And God expects us to have that respect. Then he also expects us to have respect for animal life. And that's why he said that animals may now be eaten for food, but you must kill them in the right way. You must cut their throats so that the blood leaves the body, for the blood is the life. And that's why in that covenant he expected us to take the blood out of an animal before we eat it. To put it simply, he's saying you must not eat living flesh. You must respect animal life. And therefore Jews, and incidentally Muslims, will not eat meat with the blood in it. They know that God has told us that. So here we have a situation in which the two things that God expected of us, we are ignoring. We're paying no attention to what God said to the whole human race. So are we going to be punished? The answer is no. This was an unconditional covenant. God told us what he expected of us, but he didn't attach any penalty to this covenant. And even though we all abolish capital punishment for murderers, even though we all eat meat with blood in it, God will keep his covenant, and the world will go on. So the penalty, if we fail to keep our side of it, there's no penalty with the Noah covenant. What was the purpose, or what was the period? And the answer is, it is not a covenant forever. It is only while the earth remains. So it's a covenant for human history, and it will still apply at the end of human history as it applies today. And God will go on shining the sun and sending the rain, and go on sending the rainbow when they come together, because that's part of the covenant. And every time I see a rainbow, I remember the covenant of Noah, and I thank God it's still going, and that I can benefit from it, and that the whole world can benefit from it if we share out the food as we should. Finally, what was the purpose? Well, for that, we've got to go right back to the beginning. Why did God create men and women? Why are we here? What's the point of life? What's the purpose of life? Well, I can tell you very simply why God created the human race. And the answer is this. He already had one son, and he enjoyed him so much that he wanted a bigger family. Now, I can't explain it more simply than that. And every parent will understand that. You want children. Children like yourself. Children who love you. And God wanted a bigger family, so he created all the men and women that are in the world today to be his family. That's what he wanted. And therefore, he had to make a covenant to keep the human race going so that he could get his bigger family. And that's why he's kept the human race alive. That's why we've survived, because God wants us in his family. And until you find that out, you will never know why you're here, because that's why you are here. And that's why when people become Christians and become sons and daughters of God, they feel life has a purpose now. Now I know what it's all about. Now I know why I'm here. And I've found the reason for my existence. Or as many people put it simply in their testimony, I've got a purpose in my life now, which I never had before. How many would say that of their life? Would you? Yes. And that purpose was to be sons and daughters of God. And so God has kept the human race going so that he can have more children. It's as simple as that. And that's the meaning of the Noahic covenant. Now let's move one column down to the Abrahamic covenant. Who did he make this with? He made this in Canaan, the promised land, to Abraham. Then he repeated the covenant with his son Isaac, and repeated it again with his grandson Jacob. And therefore these three generations, grandfather, father, and son, we call them the patriarchs, which means the fathers. And God did an amazing thing. God said, when I marry you, I will take your names. And God humbled himself and said, I will now be known as the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. Your names are now my name. We're married. We're in a covenant relationship. And through you, I will marry all your descendants, all the Jews, all of Israel. And every Jew today benefits from this covenant, because this was a national covenant with Abraham and his physical descendants. And he not only promised Abraham, who was already so old that he shouldn't have children, and his wife was 90, and women of 90 don't usually have babies, and yet God promised that he would have a son and as many descendants as the sand of the sea or the stars of the sky. Now, in Abraham's day, you could see 6,000 stars. Your eye, without a telescope, can see 6,000 stars. But the sands of the seashore, dear me, that's a much bigger number. And God said, I promise you descendants, and I promise you a land in which they can live forever while the earth remains. And God has kept that promise. And lo and behold, after 2,000 years, he's brought the Jewish people back to the land he promised them. We have lived to see God's promise fulfilled. Or I have lived to see it because I was alive in 1948. Some of you weren't. But you can see the state of Israel. It's on the map. It's in almost every daily newspaper in one way or another. And it's God who brought them back. I know that. I can prove it. Because Israel, the land, is in a very interesting situation. There are only two prevailing winds blow over that land. One comes from the west and one comes from the east. The wind from the west brings moisture from the Mediterranean Sea and drops rain on the hills of Judea. When the wind comes from the east and the Arabian desert, it's a dry, hot wind, which the Arabs call the khamsin. And it has no life in it at all. And when it blows from the east, the flowers wither and the grass fades and life disappears from the promised land. And that's how God disciplined his people Israel. All through the Old Testament, when he blessed them, he brought the wind from the west and the rain. When he cursed them, he brought the wind from the east and the Arabian desert. And there they were. In the days of the prophet Elijah, God kept the rain off for 3.5 years by keeping the wind in the east. And God controls the wind. So all through the Old Testament, it says that when they were doing the right thing, God brought rain. When they did the wrong thing, he brought dry, hot wind from the east. When the Jews began to go back to the Promised Land in 1875, that's well over 100 years ago, the rain began again in the Middle East. I've got the rainfall figures for 100 years, and I graphed them on a graph. And the amazing thing is you can read the political history of modern Israel from the rainfall. When more Jews went back, the rainfall went up. When no Jews went back, it leveled off. More Jews went back, rain went up again. And they had the highest rainfall for 100 years in 1948, when the state of Israel was established. Now, human beings can't control the rain. To me, that's proof that the Jews back in the Middle East, back in the land that God promised to them, were brought back by God, the God of the rain. There are many other proofs I could give you, but that's another subject altogether. And I'm not here to talk about Israel this morning. But that was God's promise to Abraham. I'll give you descendants and a land for them to live in. And he's kept his promise. The only condition he made on them was that the males should be circumcised. Their organs of reproduction should have that surgery, which would be a mark of the Jew. And God did say, if anybody will not be circumcised, then they must be cut off from the covenant. They don't belong. That's the only condition he made. And every Jew has kept that covenant and been circumcised. and it's the badge of a Jew. When Hitler was persecuting Jews, he just made the males drop their trousers. Then he said, "You're a Jew, out you go." It is the mark that they had accepted the covenant. It was their seal on the covenant. That's the only condition that was made. However, I have to say that not only was the covenant with Abraham a national covenant for him and his Jewish descendants, it was also an international covenant because it was going to affect all the nations of the world. And it was going to affect them in this way. God said to Abraham, "Anyone who blesses you, I will bless. And anyone who curses you, I will curse. And you will be a blessing to every family on earth." And God has kept that promise too. Now, don't make it a contract. Don't say, if I bless the Jews, God will bless me. That's a contract. But God, on his side, notes our attitude to Jewish people. The international part of the covenant with Abraham was that nations and people who blessed the Jews would be blessed, and those who cursed them would be cursed. And they have been. The proviso was that they believed God, that they had faith, and that they were circumcised. Then for the other nations of the world, blessed if they bless Israel, cursed if they curse Israel. Somebody who wasn't circumcised, the penalty was to be cut off. And this is a permanent covenant forever. It's not just while the earth remains, it's forever. The Jews will always be God's chosen people. And God will always be the God of Israel, the Holy One of Israel. Never forget that. The God you've come to know through Jesus is the God of Israel. And the Christ who saved you is a Jew. You owe everything you found in Christ to a Jew. Never forget that the Bible is a book written by Jews from beginning to end, with only one possible exception, Dr. Luke. But all the rest of the 40 authors were Jewish. Everything you really value, you owe to the Jews. Salvation is of the Jews, said Jesus himself. And yet the church in this country particularly, I'm finding, is now pulling up its Jewish roots. They're not praying for Israel. Indeed, they're taking the side of the Palestinians. And there's a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the Western world, which is alarming. And I hope that you will never be part of it, or you'll come under the curse of God. We're not playing games with God. This is serious. God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And the God of Abraham, his son is Jesus. And the God of Israel and the Father of Jesus are one and the same person. Never forget that. You owe your salvation not just to God, but to the Jewish people. It came to you through the Jews, and it couldn't have come any other way. God chose them to be his channel to the world. And that brings us to the purpose. Why did he make this covenant with Abraham? And the answer was because he needed a people on earth to represent him on earth, to show the whole world that God really exists and that he blesses obedience and punishes disobedience. And he chose Abraham, a dear old man. I'm looking forward to meeting him. And this dear old man believed that God meant business. and left his home, left a comfortable, brick-built, 2-story home. And Abraham left that and lived in a tent for the rest of his life at the age of 90. I don't know anybody today who'd do that. Do you? And because he did that, you are here this morning. If Abraham hadn't done that, you wouldn't be here. The Jews wouldn't be here. The God of Israel wouldn't be doing things for you. I'm putting emphasis on this because I am alarmed at the average attitude of Christians in England to the Jewish people when they owe them so much. Let's move on to the Mosaic covenant. Now, let me make a point from that first column. Of the 5 covenants in the Bible, only one is old, and only one is called new. Now, never be misled by the titles to the 2 parts of your Bible. One is entitled Old Testament or Old Covenant, and the other is entitled New Testament or New Covenant. Those are bad, misleading titles. All 5 covenants are mentioned in the Old Testament, and all 5 covenants are mentioned in the New. Only one of the 5 is called old, and only one of the 5 is called new. And the new has replaced the old. So the Messianic has replaced the Mosaic covenant. Christians benefit from all of the covenants except the Mosaic. And that's over and done with now. Thank God it is, as I'll show you in a moment. Now, do you notice the Noah's covenant was international? The Abrahamic was national and international. The Mosaic was national only. Can you see a kind of narrowing down from international to national and international to national? It'll open up again later, as we'll see, but there's a very clear pattern of increasingly concentrated attachment. And so the Mosaic covenant is national. It was made with Moses and the 12 tribes of Israel and their descendants. And it was made on Sinai. And it took the form of a marriage. And God said, I will. And all the people of Israel said, we will. They agreed to it. And this was a promise of security. So we have a promise of survival in Noah's covenant, a promise of selection in the Abraham covenant, you are to be my people, and a promise of security for the nation in the Mosaic. And in the Mosaic covenant, God said, I will give you a land of your own. I will protect you, not only from human enemies, but from natural enemies, and also from disease. I will give you a healthy, holy, happy life up in the mountains of Israel, up in the mountains of Canaan. If, and this covenant was very conditional. He said, if you live my way. And he gave them 613 commandments about how they were to live his way. He said, I'm going to put you at the center of the world, and the promised land is right in the middle of the landmass of the whole world. Jerusalem is the physical center of the whole world. And he said, I'm putting you in the middle of the world, and you're to live there my way, and then the whole world will realize that if people live my way, they will be blessed. But if they don't, they will suffer more than anybody else. And God said to the people of Israel at Sinai, that's the condition of this covenant. Are you going to accept it or reject it? And they said, we accept it. We will keep these commandments all of our lives. And so there was a marriage took place at Sinai, and it's very much like a marriage. They each made their promises, and they were bound together in a covenant marriage, not a contract, a covenant marriage. And God said, I will. And the people said, we will. And from that day, God was married to Israel. And the prophets later always called it a marriage. They said, Israel, you are God's wife. And now you've become an adulteress. You've even become a prostitute. Hosea said that. Ezekiel said that. They all said that, the prophets. You are betraying your husband, God. And from then on, the relationship between God and Israel was seen as a marriage by all the later writers, including the Song of Solomon. So that's where it all began. And the Mosaic covenant offered them security, national security. God would provide for them, protect them, and keep them in the land. However, if they did not live God's way, then there would be suffering, all kinds of suffering. God would keep his promise and curse them. If you read Deuteronomy chapter 28, you'll find all the blessings and all the curses listed. He would curse them with bad crops, with rebellious children, with invasion by enemies, with occupation by enemies. And the final punishment would be kicked out of the land of Israel. They would lose their land. And God would discipline them in these ways. He would send locusts. He would send an earthquake. And these were all warnings. You're not living my way. What God is saying to the children of Israel is, you say, I did it my way, and I will punish you. Do it his way, and you'll be blessed out of your boots. That's really what God was saying to them. And of course, they never did do it his way. When you read the 613, not just 10 commandments, 613, every aspect of life is covered by those commandments. Your marriage, your food, your clothes, your toilet arrangements. Every aspect of life is covered by Moses' laws. And you know, I'm breaking them at this very moment. One of those laws is you must not wear clothes made of more than one material. And this suit, like most suits today, is a mixture of wool and polypropylene. And I'm disobeying God's law. But then the Mosaic law is not for me. Some of its requirements are just amazing. In fact, I've got a book down here by a man called Jacobs. He's a Jew, and he's a journalist in New York. But he doesn't believe in God. However, he decided, for a bit of journalism, to try and live by the Bible for 1 year. And for 1 year, everything he read in the Bible, he tried to put into practice. And he's written a book about it, The Year of Living Biblically. It's one of the funniest books I've ever read, because he got in such a stew. One law of Moses said you mustn't sit on a chair that your wife has sat on if she's having her monthly period. And one day he came home, and he was just about to sit in his favorite chair, and his wife said, I've sat on that chair. So he jumped off it, and he went over to sit on another chair. She said, I've sat on that chair as well. And then she said, I've sat on every chair in the house. The poor man, trying to live biblically, couldn't sit on a chair in his own house. That's just one of the funny things that happened. And of course, he did, there he is, and he did grow a beard, and he did change his clothes for a long white nightie, cotton. There he is in his cotton dress, and everybody laughed at him, and he had such a job. And the interesting thing is that he found the New Testament harder to live by than the Old. Isn't that interesting? Jesus' standards are much higher than Jewish standards. Did you realize that? Much stricter. Jews said, you mustn't get into bed with a woman who's not your wife. That's adultery. And Jesus said, you mustn't even look at a woman and wish you could. That's tough. And they said, you mustn't kill a man. And Jesus said, you mustn't even wish him dead. Or even call him a fool or an idiot. That's murder in Jesus' eyes. And his standards are much harder. The new covenant is a good deal tougher than the old covenant, with all its 613 commandments, including the Sabbath. Oh, the Jewish attitude to the Sabbath is ludicrous. It's laughable. If you go to Jerusalem and you stay in a hotel, one day of the week you'll press the button and it won't go up. Do you know that Jews can't wear false teeth on the Sabbath? That's carrying a burden. And they can't walk with a stick on the Sabbath, because if they drag it in the dust and leave a line, that's plowing. And you mustn't plow on the Sabbath. And you mustn't use a safety pin to hold your clothes together on the Sabbath, because that's sewing. That's work. Now, you may laugh at these, but Jesus faced all this. His early problems were with Sabbath keepers, and they plotted his death even. Thank God I'm not under the old covenant. Thank God I'm not under it.